You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
For the last several weeks, I have been away from the golden Dixie Heritage microphone, away from my office, away from my home, away from our church, away from all of the things that I'm normally doing. And it was quite a whirlwind trip, let me put it that way. All over the place. And it's good to be home. Good to be back behind the golden Dixie Heritage microphone once again. And of course, as many of you know, I finished the trip Sunday, June 9th. I was in Antietam, Maryland, there at the Antietam battlefield, and I gave a talk that morning, or rather, I guess early afternoon is when it turned out happening, there at the battlefield, and it was an event that was co-sponsored by the Barnes Review and the Citizens Informer magazine. And a lot of people had responded by email saying that they wished they could have come, they just could not make the distance. Now that said, of the crowd that was there, we had to pitch a tent outside of the venue because the crowd would not fit in the building. And so we had to pitch a tent outside. And there were people who had driven from everywhere. One couple had driven over 3 hours from Pennsylvania. Another couple had driven about 2 hours from Pennsylvania. We had people that had come from all over Virginia and all over West Virginia. We had people from all over Maryland, people from Delaware. So we had people who had come in. I think the closest that anybody had driven was about 35 minutes. And so it was very humbling for me that we had advertised that, of course, nationally. And then to have all of these people come in from all of these places all over the country. I just want to say to everybody who was at the meeting, thank you. And I enjoyed getting to meet each and every one of you. But for those of you who did not come, we have a special treat for you, especially because I have had so many phone calls and so many emails over the last few days of people wanting to know how they can get a copy of the lecture. They're like, was it recorded? Is there any way we can get it on CD? Can we get a DVD? Can we get a video? Are you going to be uploading something? Can we buy something? People want to know how they can hear the program that we put on there in Antietam. And so what we're going to do is today's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour is going to be a recording of that event. It just so happened that somebody had recorded it with their cell phone and had given me a copy of the recording. And so that's going to be today's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. We will, of course, be inserting the commercials and things that would appear normally in our broadcast into the program at different places. Where the program begins here is just a few seconds into my talk, and I'm beginning basically telling a story of something that happened the first day of my second semester of Bible college. So Dr. Grady takes us all down to the chapel, and he has us form a line leading up to the pulpit. The first guy is in the line. Dr. Grady points to the pulpit. He says, preach. The guy's like, well, what do you want me to preach? And Dr. Grady just said, well, the Bible says be instant in season and out of season. That means you need to be ready to preach all the time. You just failed this class. You're going to walk out that door. You're going to go down that hallway. You're going to go to the registrar's office. You're going to tell Dean Stubblefield that you just failed my class and that you need to repeat it next semester. And the kid standing there, he goes, I'm not joking. Go to Dean Stubblefield's office. Tell him you just failed my class and you're taking it again next semester. And he goes, the sooner you walk out that door, the sooner I can resume teaching this class. So this kid, he looks at the second kid in line, who's now the first kid in line, points to the pulpit, he says, preach. Well, this kid doesn't want to do what the last kid did. So he walks up to the pulpit, and he opens up his Bible. He starts mumbling something. He's reading something. And Dr. Grady goes, Isaiah 58 and verse 1, lift up thy voice like a trumpet. Well, I can't hear you. Go to Dean Stubblefield's office. You just failed the class. You can take it next semester. Kid leaves. I'm the third person in line. I'm like, oh, great.
So I walk up to the pulpit, and as loud as I go, I said, the Bible says in Romans 10:14, and how should they hear without a preacher? What this world needs today is preaching. I'm not talking about philosophy. I'm talking about preaching. I'm not talking about babysitting. I'm talking about preaching. And Dr. Grady goes, what's your name? I said, Edward DeVries. He goes, that's enough, Brother DeVries. He said, you've made the point. He said, now we're going to go back to the classroom. So I got to finish the semester. But I learned something. If you're going to speak, make sure people can hear you. So, again, can everybody hear me? All right. Proverbs 14 and verse 34. One church that I pastored, they didn't even turn on the PA system. They complained I was too loud. Yeah, the microphone, they would use it for the music, and then I'd get up and the sound guy would turn it off. But anyways, Proverbs 14 and 34 says, righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. You've heard that verse before. You've heard preachers use that verse. They take it way out of context. And let me explain why they take that way out of context and why the application is so wrong. That word nation in Hebrew is the word goy. It simply means a people. In the New Testament, we see the word nation as well. It comes from the Greek word ethnos. It also means a people. But more specifically, it also means a race. And so most people mistakenly believe that a nation is a political construct within certain borders. But that would be a state. Not a nation, but a state. A nation may have a state, but the two are not interchangeable. For example, France, Germany, historically, they would be nation states. But a nation is a distinct people. They have a common racial or ethnic characteristics often, like Anglo-Celtic, for example. But they always have a unique history, a common culture, a common language. They usually have a common religion, common traditions, and so forth. Now, the United States ceased to be a nation decades ago. It still operates as a state. In other words, the government is still in place. Actually, it's not even a state anymore. It's more of an empire. But the United States ceased to be a nation decades ago. If for no other reason the United States ceased to be a nation, for the same reason that ancient Greece ceased to be a nation or ancient Rome ceased to be a nation, because it just got too big. It absorbed too much territory. It absorbed and conquered too many nations. And as empires expand, as they assimilate different races and religions, languages and cultures, in other words, as they absorb other nations into themselves, the original nation is displaced by the empire. The state continues, but the nation ceases to exist. And that's the case of our government. But it's gone a step further because some in the leadership of our state abuse their authority and the power of their agencies to displace the nation that founded it with aliens. That said, as nationalist, or at least myself, I'm not yet to the point where I'm seeking the destruction of the state. But I am to the place where I'm calling upon the state to protect and promote the interests of the underlying nation that established it. To illustrate this, the same thing happened in the old Soviet Union. If you go back in recorded history, you'll find that the Russian nation, you can find it in recorded history as far back as 862 AD. To do the math real quick, that's 1157 years. And so for over 1,000 years, the Russian nation has had a common language. It's had a common religion in Orthodox Christianity, which, by the way, Orthodox Christianity survived in spite of the Soviet era. The Soviets murdered 60 million Orthodox Christians, and yet the faith persisted. Russia has had a fairly homogeneous culture that also survived despite the Soviet era. And with the exception of the Soviet era, Russia has had a fairly common racial and ethnic composition. Now, during the Soviet era, and especially under Stalin, the Soviet Union took in massive amounts of land. And with that land came people whose religion and their culture and their ethnicity were not like those of the Russian people. The Soviet state actually hoped to break apart the Russian culture and the Russian nation. In fact, Russian nationalism was a crime punishable by death in the Soviet Union. You say, well, why would the Soviets be so afraid of Russian nationalism? And I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I'll go ahead and clue you in on the little secret, because the Russian nation had been around for 1,100 years. The Soviet Union was new. The Soviet Union had had 14 predecessor governments. It didn't want to be the next one in the line. In other words, nations endure, governments come and go. The Soviet Union wanted to come and stay. The only way it could do that was to destroy the Russian nation. So, how are they going to do that? How were the Soviets going to destroy the Russian nation? By inserting millions of conquered aliens into it. And you know that Marxism is doing the same thing in Europe and in the United States today? In other words, our nation is being diluted, and dare I say, even conquered, but not by conquest. Simply by forced immigration. Sid talked about that a moment ago. He said that somewhere along the way, he said the left realized that migration was a natural force of nature. Let's weaponize it. And that's exactly what the Marxists have done. And so in order to solidify the power of the state must destroy the underlying nation. Because, as I said, governments know full well that nations outlive states. Governments, states come and go. Nations, unless they're destroyed, endure. Going back to the Russian example. The Russian nation has existed in documented written history since 862. The early Slavs, or the Rus, as they were called, I believe are the same Russian nation that's reasserting itself today. And we see traces of the Rus going back prior to the 9th century, if you add the oral history to the written history, at least into the 600s. And so during a 1,300-year period, Russia has had 16 different and unique governments. One nation with 16 different and unique governments ruling over it. In the pre-9th century, there was the early Slavs, or the Rus. Then from 632 to 668, there was the old great Bulgarian nation. From 650 to 969, there was the Khazar Khaganate. Then in the 9th century, there was the Rus Khaganate. From the 9th to the 13th century, there was the Volga Bulgarians. From roughly the 800s to the 1200s, the Kievan Rus. Then the 1100s to the 1300s, there was the Grand Duchy of Vladimir. There's some overlap to some of these. Again, because nations endure, governments come and go. 1136 to 1478, there was the Novgorod Republic. The 1240s to the 1480s, there was the Golden Horde. 1283 to 1547, the Grand Duchy of Moscow. From 1547 to 1721, you had the Tsardoms of Russia. 1721 to 1917, you had the Russian Empire. 1917, there was the Russian Republic. That was the first Marxist attempt. Then there was the Russian SFSR, which lasted from 1917 to 1991. From 1922 to 1991 was the Soviet Union. Yes, Russia had two governments during that time. Why? The Soviets never consolidated power. In fact, had it not been for World War II, the Russian people would have freed themselves of the Soviets entirely had the United States and England not basically propped up the Soviets in World War II. And even beyond, the Cold War was a joke. There was no Cold War. The banks of New York were pouring money into the Soviets as fast as they could get it to Moscow to keep that regime afloat. But yet they never consolidated power. Anyways, 1991 to the present is the Russian Federation. Governments come, governments go. And that is why governments fear nationalism. It's why Stalin sought to flood the Russian nation with aliens. It's why in the US and the UK, our governments are flooding their nations with migrants. I will say this, at least to Stalin's credit, he made the migrants learn Russian. And while Stalin hated the Russian culture, he tried to establish a new Soviet culture, and he tried to force his migrants to assimilate into it. Nowadays, all forms of assimilation are just discouraged.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Despite all of the efforts of the Soviets, the Russian nation reasserted itself. And let me say this, I believe Vladimir Putin is a nationalist. And that is why the powers that be in this world, or for those of you who know who Lady Michelle Renouf in England is, she says the powers that should not be. By the way, last Friday she was my guest on my radio show, so if you go to look up the Dixie Heritage Hour online, you can hear that interview. But the reason that the powers that should not be hate Vladimir Putin in Russia is because Russia, the Russian nation, has emerged. And Vladimir Putin is a nationalist, and he's not discouraging the Russian nation's emergence, he's promoting it and empowering it. By the way, that's why they hated Adolf Hitler. Germany and Adolf Hitler is painted as the greatest evil in the history of the world. But what was Nazism? National socialism. The socialism's okay, but the nationalism's not. Anyways, I'm getting sidetracked. But Russia, governments came, governments went, the nation endured. Germany, Hitler called his government the Third Reich for a reason. There were two Reichs before it. In other words, governments came, governments went. But the German nation has endured since 750 BC. They were conquered by the Romans and their Celtic religion was replaced with Christianity. But the nation continued. The kings of Germany would become the kings of the Holy Roman Empire. As the Roman Empire dissolved, then there was the Frankish government. The poor Germans even had to endure Soviet government for a few years. But the German nation is reasserting itself. And that is why the European Union is passing all of these anti-nationalist laws. Because they fear the reemergence of the German nation. Not to mention the yellow vests in France. The reason that they fear that, in fact, France just passed a law that all forms of demonstration are illegal. Even peaceful demonstration. Why? Because this yellow vest movement has France quaking in its boots. You say, why? The French nation is reasserting itself. Why is Brexit so popular in the UK? The English nation and the Scottish nation and the Irish nations are reasserting themselves. Governments come and governments go, and the only way the government can survive is to kill the nation. And so empires do their best. The Greeks tried to destroy the nations they conquered, so did the Romans. The British have tried it, the Soviets tried it. Now we're seeing it in the American Empire and the European Union. And because of that, we're seeing these revivals of nationalism all over the world. You say, and by the way, that's why the governments of this world hate nationalism. Because if these nations reemerge, what are they going to do? They're going to replace the existing governments with governments that actually serve their purpose. In other words, the New World Order cannot come about as long as there are strong nations. So as long as there are nations, there's hope. The United States. Let's look at America for a moment. There was once an American nation. It was governed by Great Britain. Colonists were coming over. as those colonists began to form into a nation of their own, as that nation on this continent began to emerge, what did it do? It shook off the British government, created one of its own choosing. And then when that government, formed under the Articles of Confederation, didn't work, again, what did the American nation do? It shook that off and it formed yet another government under the Constitution. From the 16th century to the 18th century, the American nation has had at least three governments, at least. And then in 1861, 13 states seceded from the American Union. Why? Because a southern nation was emerging. And when it did, what did it do? Shook off the chains of the Yankees. And so for 4 years, even if for only 4, the southern nation had its own government. And it took all of Abraham Lincoln's horses and all of Abraham Lincoln's men to conquer the southern nation again. And so the American nation has had 3 governments. The southern nation has had 4, even if the 4th was short-lived. Do you realize Texas has had 4 governments? There was the colonial government under Mexico. What happened is the colonists to Texas began to emerge as their own nation. They shook off Mexico. They formed the Republic of Texas. Republic of Texas couldn't pay its bills, so what did they do? They sold their soul to the United States for the payment of their debts. Then they became part of the Confederacy. So again, we're looking at least 4 governments in Texas. So even on our own continent, in our very short period of history, governments come, governments go, nations endure. The reason there are so many nations in Europe's a big place. North America is a big place. In fact, North America is probably too big of a landmass to consist of just one nation. And so as the United States, as the empire expanded westward, it began to absorb other nations. Not to mention the fact we imported in a bunch of Africans. And now they've been part of the population for 3 centuries. And then in the 19th century, they brought in all kinds of Asians. Why? Because they freed the slaves. Now we need cheap labor to build the railroads. We don't have slaves to do it, so they bring in the Asians. And then there's all these migrants from Mexico, from the Middle East. And so not only does the government of the United States govern the nation of people that founded it, but now it's governing multiple nations. That's why you hear this word thrown around, balkanization. All balkanization is simply the continent sorting itself out back into the nations that compose it. And that's why the empire is quaking in its boots. Because as these nations assert themselves, the American empire is going to do exactly what the Roman Empire did, which is fractionalize into a bunch of smaller nations who are going to establish their own governments and reassert themselves. Now, that can happen one of 2 ways. It can happen peacefully. If it happens peacefully, the United States, as we know it, divides into 6, 7, maybe 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, who knows how many different nations. Alaska and Hawaii never wanted to be part of the United States. You say, but they voted for statehood, didn't they? The people who lived there did not vote for statehood. There were massive military bases in both places. And all the military personnel voted for statehood. You couldn't fill a Kleenex box with the ballots of Native Alaskans or Hawaiians that voted for statehood. And so both places have been trying to get out of the United States since the day they were forced to become states. And so Alaskan independence movement, Hawaiian independence movement. And so Alaska and Hawaii just become their own states automatically. Texas becomes its own government automatically, its own nation automatically. Now that said, I believe that South and West Texas are going to get chopped off with New Mexico, Arizona, California, and absorbed back into Mexico. Or else it becomes its own Hispanic nation. Northern California to Washington State, that's just going to become its own nation of weirdos. Utah, Idaho, Nevada, the Dakotas will become Mormon nation. Montana will fractionalize and divide into its neighbors. Or depending on how much real estate certain people can lay claim to, might become a bunch of small ethno-states. The Muslims are going to take Minnesota, let them have it. By the way, they can have Detroit. The Midwest, minus Chicago and maybe St. Louis, I believe will become a predominantly white country. The states of the old Confederacy, minus Texas and Virginia, will probably emerge as another nation, but it'll probably be primarily black. The New England states, we'll call that the Northeastern Confederacy. They're going to do their best to establish Karl Marx's utopia. And Bernie Sanders will finally become the president of something. Canada probably fractionalizes. And that's if it happens peacefully. You say, well, what's the other alternative? The United States and Canada do not want to give up their empires. So what are they going to do? They will literally slaughter the nations to maintain the state. Stalin wasn't afraid to murder 60 million people. You say, well, I don't think that our government is capable of that. Well, because you're naive, I'm going to throw in some great beachfront property in Arizona with every book you buy today. But really, that's the choice that any government has. If it wants to survive, it has to destroy its nation. Or eventually, the nation, when it realizes its government no longer serves its purposes, shakes it off and forms a new one. Now you know the difference between a state and a nation. I saw this meme the other day. It said, "I'm proud to be an Asian," said the Asian man. Then below that it said, "I'm proud to be black," said the black man. And then below that it said, "I'm proud to be white," said the racist. But the nation that founded the United States was a nation of white Europeans. We cleared the wilderness, we built the roads, we built the cities, we built the universities, and we were the majority. But in an attempt to destroy the underlying nation, the state has imported in hordes and hordes and hordes of aliens. So as Sid said earlier, within a few years, we will be the minority. Do you know the same thing happened in South Africa? And you know what's happening in South Africa right now? If you read my article a few months ago on the American Free Press, or in the Barnes Review, they're genociding whites in South Africa. My fear is that it could happen here. But let me put this into a perspective for you. White people built every great civilization known to man. And we were the majority race in the world for millennia. But by 1900, worldwide, whites were only 30% of the population. Do you want to know what we are in 2019? 7%. Even without genocide. Just miscegenation with the alien hordes. We're on the border of extinction. We're literally an endangered species. And that's why Russia under Putin has cut off all immigration and even tourism. Do you realize that to be a tourist to Russia, you have to be a white Christian? And you have to be able to have someone in that country sponsor you to come as a tourist? And if you want to migrate there, you have to be a white Christian and prove to them that you can contribute to their culture. And that is not Putin and the Russian people being racist. That's just a nation surviving and actually thriving. Russia probably has the best economy in the world going on right now. Our media is not reporting it, and that's why the world is coming against them in force. Because the powers that should not be do not want to see their folk survive and thrive. But yet for the last 2 decades they have. Do you want to know why the media hates Donald Trump so voraciously? Do you want to know why they're tearing down monuments as fast as they can get ropes around them and hook them up to pickup trucks? Do you want to know why they hate our folk? It's the same in Europe. Because the reemergence of our nation threatens them. God created the peoples of the world. God created our nation. But God did not necessarily create its government. God created the nations, and the nations created their governments. I think it was Jefferson who said that a patriot loves his nation, but not necessarily its government. I said at the beginning, I'm not advocating the overthrow of the government, but I am calling upon the government to protect and promote the interest of its nation. And if our nation can peacefully coexist with the other nations that have migrated to our continent, I'm okay with that. If those nations cannot peacefully coexist with us, there is a legal remedy. It's called deportation. But I love my nation, I love my folk, I love my people. That's where my patriotism lies. And the truth is we have a government that's no longer of the people, by the people, or for the people. Because if it was, it wouldn't be so hostile towards its underlying nation. I know this, I do not want to be like Thomas Jefferson said, waking up homeless on the continent that my fathers conquered. I'm going to close with this, then we can eat lunch. Generally, war between the states is on the horizon. The southern nation is emerging. And Lee is offered command of the Union Army. And he said this, he said, if Virginia stands by the old Union, so will I. But if she secedes, then I will follow my native people. With my sword and need be with my life. I must side either with or against my country. And he wasn't referring to its government at that moment. He said, I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, and my children. Only in their defense will I raise my sword. It sounds to me like General Lee was a nationalist. And whether by choice or by necessity, so am I. All I can say is, so help us God. My ongoing prayer is that God will bless the nation, I guess probably despite its government. But Father, I pray that you would bless our nation. I pray that you would bless our people. I pray that you'd prepare us to stand strong in the days to come, and I pray that you'd bless the food that we're about to eat. And we ask it in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. www.americanfreepress.net and find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about
Well, that was my talk in Antietam. I hope that being able to hear it on today's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour was a blessing and an encouragement to you. If you would like to have a copy of this on DVD, if you would send me an email, director@dixieheritage.net, and I will tell you how you can get a copy of it on DVD. Here a couple of weeks ago, we had done a radio show with Carrie Ross, and if you heard that program, you remember that Carrie is the girlfriend, fiance of John Hatley, and John Hatley, of course, is one of the Leavenworth 10, who is in the military prison at Leavenworth for a crime he did not commit. And of course, there are several people who are seeking to have him pardoned by President Trump. Included in those are John Hatley's parents. And shortly after we did that interview, both John Hatley's mother and father submitted videos that they took on their iPhones. And they texted them to me and asked if I would put them into one of our upcoming radio broadcasts. And I told them I would do so as soon as we had some type of a gap in the programming, some type of maybe a program that didn't quite take up the whole hour. And of course, this is one of those programs. And so what I want to do here is I want to share a video very briefly from John Hatley's father, who is also a retired Baptist preacher in East Texas.
My name is Darrell Hatley, and my son is incarcerated at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And you asked me, am I proud of my son? Take a look. He is a patriot to the, what shall I say, 10th degree. They don't give these things away. Integrity. Listen, I'll trust John's integrity to anybody's integrity. I love him. He's proved himself. He was inducted into the Audie Murphy Club, and I thought I was going to a rinky-dink ceremony. And as we sat down, the commander that sat next to me said, "Are you Hatley's parents?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You ought to be very proud of that young man." Said, "Not every soldier is able to be inducted into the Audie Murphy Club." Said, "What they have to do is outstanding." And they had me convinced, but his life also has had me convinced. He has sacrificed so much for his country. I never dreamed that he would be a POW in America, because he served his country faithfully. He has the integrity. My question is on some of the others.
And here is a video that was shot right after that one. And this is John Hatley's mother appealing for the release of her son.
My name's Ann Hatley, and my son's Johnny Hatley. And he's been incarcerated for now over 10 years for a crime he's not guilty of. He's really been away from us for almost 30 years because he spent nearly 20 years serving his country. And he loves his country, and he loved his soldiers. And his big concern when he was in war was that he had trained them well enough that they would come home to their parents and their families. And he's always been a person of honor. I can't even stress that enough. Even as when he was very young, he would stand up for the underdog, and he would just be there. And he's always cared for us, his parents, so much that his main desire was to come home and take care of us as we've gotten older, especially. And that's what he planned on doing when he spent his 20 years and came and got to come home. And because he found out, being gone so many years, how much time he had missed that he wanted to make up for. And although we're very, very proud of the time he served and what he gave to his country. We're sick to our heart that his country didn't give it back to him and didn't care for him. And they've just left him hanging. I don't even have words to express the pain that we feel. And it's not that we don't have other children that try to take care of us, and they do, but he feels so responsible because he's that type of man. And I don't have any other words to say except how much we love him and how proud we are of him. And I just ask that y'all would give him his freedom.
Of course, John Hatley recently turned 50. They're in the prison in Leavenworth, and so both of his parents are in their late 70s. And his mother, in particular, because of her health, she's simply not able to make the long trip from East Texas to Leavenworth, Kansas, to visit her son. So they used to go regularly, at least once a month, to visit their son. And now, while the father is still making the trips, the mother, unfortunately, is not able to make them and is not able to see her son because her health simply will not allow her to make the long trip. And so her heart aches even more because she's unable to see her son. And of course, that's understandable. But these are the appeals of parents. They're obviously heartfelt and real. And let me say this, it amazes me that this couple can remain patriotic to a government that has so wrongly persecuted their son, when all he was doing was serving the government, serving the country they're serving in the military and serving honorably, and for him to have been treated the way he has been treated, and yet they maintain their love and their patriotism and so forth. It's just amazing. But we're going to have to break here, and so we are going to have a brief commercial for the North Carolina Heritage Fund. And then we'll be back with the conclusion of this week's TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. Stay tuned. The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. We have a few minutes left in the hour, and what I want to do is I want to share a conversation that I had with Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson. I was handed an academic paper in my recent trip, and it was a paper written by Dr. Johnson, the title of which was that the state is the natural enemy of the ethnos. And as I read it, I thought this is the perfect companion to the comments that I'm going to make in my lecture at Antietam. And so what I've done is I've reached out to Dr. Johnson by Skype and just asked him to spend a few minutes sharing with us the primary thought of his great paper. And so let's slip it in here. Just basically explain that concept to us, and why is the state the enemy of the ethnos?
Okay.
Why is the state the enemy of the nation?
Early on, very early on, I was intrigued by national anarchism. And national anarchism is based on this concept. There's an error out there amongst academics, a lot of people, that when we refer to nations, we're referring to governments. And it comes from the old myth that nations, that is to say, groups of people, ethnicities, and I use those terms completely synonymously, is a creation of the state, which is an absurd concept. Now, Mussolini, in his Doctrine of Fascism, says explicitly that there are no nations, that the state creates the nation, gives it life, and gives it form. And someone like Adolf Hitler said the exact opposite. Hitler was never a fascist for that reason. Fascism says the state is the only political entity. And it really didn't even matter the characteristics of the people within the state. The only thing that mattered was loyalty. And he made that very clear. And if that's one of the cardinal principles of fascism, then most people who are called that could never be. The two entities are completely separate. The ethnos is flowing. It's hard to quantify. It's cultural. You can see it in its music and its cuisine and its dress and religious services. It's literature, how people behave. You can't really quantify that. But the modern state is exactly the opposite. It functions by force. It has formal offices, bureaucratic organization. Everything's organized. Everything's quantified. So the two entities are usually at war. Now, they don't have to be. There are legitimate governments out there, and legitimacy really is defined as the state functioning as close to the national culture as possible. Today, unfortunately, the state is necessary for the sake of protecting the ethnos and these with globalization. What are the options to fight it? The state is the only option. And in places like Russia, Belarus, and elsewhere, the state is a to some extent a faithful representative of the ethnos. When we refer to the people, that's a meaningless abstraction. When I refer to an ethnic group or a nation, that is not. That is something very real and very concrete. Hard to define. It does change over time, but so do families. And no one denies that. No one denies that individuals exist. But individuals change over time and take ideas from elsewhere. So the arguments against nationalism are usually very poor ones, but they're taken for granted in academia, led by the recently, thank God, dead Eric Hobsbawm, even people like Ernst Gellner. Globalization has long since taken over the ideology of academics, and therefore any form of nationalism that isn't, American black nationalism or Jewish nationalism is spit on. The same people who deny any real foundation for a Ukrainian nation or a Polish nation are the same people who believe in the individual or the international community or that weird thing called European values that Angela Merkel keeps talking about. That they have no problem talking. The rational consumer, they have no problem in talking about. They believe that. But they don't believe in the nation, which is just really an extension of the family. The state couldn't have created the nation in any real sense because you have millions of people who identified that nation as their own and were willing to die for it. The state never had that kind of power. The state doesn't have the power to alter people's thought process. Maybe the media does over time. But that's one hell of a trick. The argument used to be that as countries modernized and became industrialized, the need for literacy, the need for a standardized worker, all doing the same kind of thing, created urbanization, the need for a single mass media, and a single education system. And that created this artificial national culture. The problem is that that's not what happened. And the countries with the strongest national movements are all agrarian. Nations are ancient. People generally marry those who speak the same language and look like them. That's always been the case. Therefore, nations are as old as anything else. They're no different than any species of dog or a species of plant. So they're completely different from. They don't have to be enemies. But unfortunately, the way people are, the state wants to believe that it's autonomous, doesn't have to listen to anybody, has its own interests and pursues them, and therefore they become opponents. They don't have to be. There are examples where a state legitimately reflects the interests of the ethnos. I mean, the state of Israel is a good example of that. So that's really what I mean when I say that they have a tendency to be enemies.
But history has basically shown us, though, that at some point, generally, there's a conflict between the two. The state's interests, or the state begins to serve its own interests.
Right.
And then at some point, obviously, there is conflict between the nation and the state. And, you know, in my study, I believe that I found 16 different governments in Russia, for example. You may know of more. Your study's more extensive than mine. But the point being, you know, that the governments come, the governments go, but the nation has endured. I mean, even in the United States, we've had 4 governments in the brief history of our peoples on this continent. And so...
You mean forms of government?
Right. The nation endures, but states come and go.
You mean forms of government, yeah. The Slavophiles, the leaders of the Russian nationalists in the 19th century used to say that, and I agree with them 100%, that when Peter the Great moved the capital from Moscow to Petersburg, it was a revolution. It was a beginning of foreign domination of Russia, the urban control over the rural areas, and it did create a completely artificial culture up there. Unfortunately, no one ever really accepted it as their own, and this is where the old believers came from. And throughout the 18th century, the Petersburg bureaucracy, small though it was not taken, was not accepted by the average Russian peasant. Moscow was the capital of Russia. It was a completely different world, the Muscovite world. St. Petersburg was a foreign imposition. You see, the minute you have to use a lot of force to impose a law, the battle's already lost. Law doesn't matter unless people feel that it comes from them. Not from them personally, but from the culture from which they're from. One of the central concepts I've used for nations is, the term I coined is structures of survival. Nations have all been through the mill, especially small ones, foreign occupation, genocide, warfare, and they've survived. But how do they do it? They've created institutions, ways of thinking, ways of being that allow them to survive and get closer and closer, to consolidate their forces in the face of external threats and internal threats. Those structures of survival is exactly what we mean by the nation, what I mean by the nation. And again, families are no different. How do you adapt to very difficult circumstances? Well, that's exactly the sort of things that bring you together and that create the loyalty, the bonds there. A state can't create that artificially. The media can't create that artificially. There's no such thing as European values in the sense that Merkel uses the term. She usually uses it having something to do with the migrants or something like that. It's a meaningless phrase. Cosmopolitanism is a meaningless abstraction. There is no abstract man. There's never been an abstract man. There's never been an abstract government. Those are numbers on a page. But modernity sees men that way, sees men as voters or consumers or taxpayers. That's how it sees people, as abstractions, as ledger numbers. The nation is completely different that way. Today, the great traditions of our various peoples, ancient and medieval traditions of our various peoples, is found in the nation, and therefore nationalism has to exist to protect those. It's a way to protect them from external threats. Unfortunately, the state is necessary so that the nation can be taken seriously and have a certain amount of armed force to defend itself. Now, again, the Palestinians for a long time didn't have a state, and they suffered greatly, but they functioned. The Kurds didn't have a state. There's plenty of stateless nations out there, but they struggle and they suffer. Unfortunately, states are necessary, but you're correct. Eventually, there's going to be a conflict. In Russia, it's very clear it was a move to the capital and the revolutionary ideology of Peter the Great, Peter the First, that changed everything. alter Russian history forever. So that you're absolutely right about that. Even the best of systems will eventually come to blows, because conceptually, the nation and the state are two very, very, very different things.
Well, you had mentioned the closest example we probably have of a nation and a state that are, pretty homogenous is Israel. And of course, Israel is a very small piece of real estate. So is that proof of the fact that the more real estate the state occupies, the harder it is to be homogenous with its underlying nation?
Well, it's something that even James Madison talked about. Niccolo Machiavelli talked about that. Small nations are vulnerable. Israel has survived despite everything. Small nations are vulnerable. Countries with huge territories like Russia or China are not homogenous, but they certainly have a homogenous ruling class. That was not the case in 18th century Russia, but that changed later. In China, the Han Chinese are the dominant group. They're just a slight majority of the population. But remember, empires aren't countries. The Russian Empire, had units underneath it, like Poland and Finland, that were completely self-governing. It wasn't like an American state or a province of Canada. They had their own lives. The only thing they couldn't have is their own foreign policy. So an empire is a different story. An empire is not a state. It may have certain state structures, but those are devolved to the independent units. It's really the creation almost of a common unity, a common market. The Roman Empire began this, no, countries are different in the sense that a state is a more or less unified body. But if anything, you devolve authority to your constituent parts, which is always dangerous, but that's, China's doing that right now. Russia's always done that and did it successfully. There would be no reason for, say, the Finns to want independence from the Russian Empire at any time, unless, of course, they're being financed by an outside force. So in terms of land area, there's nothing intrinsic about land area, but there's a tendency for it to just encompass more groups of people. But an empire is a different story. Empires are not states, but they do share things in common.
So do you think it's possible, given the fact that the United States is basically an empire now, do you think it's possible that the United States could give that autonomy and that sovereignty to the nations that compose it, or do you think that we're just beyond that point now?
Well, the United States automatically shows, the term shows that it was never a nation. It was a confederation. The first government, I know is the Articles of Confederation. It was actually a series of different groups of people, Celts, Englishmen, French, Russians in the far west, Indians, with a very loosely associated under a central government. That's what the U.S. is. It was never meant to be a nation. It's a collection of nations. The ruling class had a tendency to be very similar. But that doesn't mean that it's still not a group of states, a group of regions. The whole Southern secessionist movement was based on this notion that Lincoln is wrong. This isn't a single nation. This is a confederation, and we could leave at any time. I think as the economy begins to collapse worse and worse, local units, I don't know if they're going to be states necessarily, will start taking more and more power to themselves and social groups. That's where we come in, building an infrastructure where we could take that devolved power and serve our people with. That's really our job right now. The U.S. breaking into Texas or California, New England, the southern states as separate, more or less autonomous countries. That's probably in our future. Hawaii will go its own way, of course. Alaska. That's definitely in our future, but it would require a great degree of economic collapse and pathology for that to happen. So I think that will be the case, but where it's going to go is another matter.
And with that, we're going to bring this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour to a close. If you saw that really cool-looking Confederate flag in the background there in Dr. Johnson's room, that's actually a Russian nationalist flag, and where the St. Andrew's Cross comes together, there in the middle, there are the two Russian eagles and so forth. You really couldn't see that from the lighting. But that's what that neat-looking flag was. At any rate, I'd like to invite you to go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net, subscribe to the newsletter, and when you do, we'll send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. So from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, until next week, God bless.